I have spent 30 years studying how naval power is projected, how it is sustained, and under what specific conditions it fails, in ways that redefine every strategic calculation that depended on its invulnerability. In all those years, across every conflict I have analyzed, every naval engagement I have studied, and every policy deliberation I have participated in, at the highest levels of the American national security establishment, I have never been required to write a sentence that I am now required to write tonight. The USS Nimitz is gone, not damaged, not disabled, not retreating toward a friendly port, trailing smoke and flooding compartments. Gone. 97,000 tons of American naval power, the oldest and most storied carrier in the United States Navy's active fleet, the vessel that has represented American maritime dominance in every ocean on the planet for nearly half a century, is on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz. And 6,200 American sailors, the men and women who operated every system on that ship, who maintained every aircraft on its flight deck, who lived and worked inside its hull, are missing, not rescued, not accounted for in lifeboats, missing. In waters where survival timelines are measured in hours and the rescue infrastructure required to reach them has been systematically disrupted by the same operational package that sent their ship to the bottom. 890 Khorramshahr, 4 ballistic missiles fired from Iranian launch positions along the Hormuz coastline, and from mobile platforms dispersed across the Iranian strategic geography, engaged the Nimitz strike group in an operational sequence that lasted less than 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, the most visible symbol of American naval power that has ever sailed through the Strait of Hormuz was located, tracked, targeted, and destroyed by a nation that the Western strategic community has spent 2 decades dismissing as incapable of projecting serious military power against American carrier strike groups. The dismissal was wrong. The 40 minutes proved it wrong in the most irreversible way that a strategic assessment can be proven wrong. With the lives of 6,200 American sailors, in Washington, the senior leadership of the most powerful military establishment in human history sat in the Situation Room and confronted a reality for which no contingency plan in the American military's planning library had prepared them. Not because contingency plans for carrier vulnerability did not exist, they did, but because every one of those plans was built on threat assessments that placed the outer boundary of Iranian anti-ship capability at a level that 890 Khorramshahr-4 missiles exceeded before the Nimitz's. Combat Direction Center had completed its initial threat response sequence. This is what I know. This is what the evidence shows. This is U.S. Watch Truth. 4 questions are going to drive everything I cover tonight, and I want to lay them out before we go into the analysis because each one connects to the others in ways that only become fully visible when you see the complete picture they collectively produce. First, how did 890 Khorramshahr-4 missiles locate, track, and destroy a carrier strike group operating at full combat readiness? With its complete defensive suite active, its combat air patrol airborne, and its Aegis destroyers in full engagement mode. And what does the operational sequence of the Hormuz engagement reveal about the depth of Iranian anti-ship targeting capability that Western naval planning consistently refused to credit as achievable? Second, what is the Khorramshahr-4 anti-ship ballistic missile at a fundamental technical level? Why does its specific combination of terminal seeker capability, maneuvering reentry vehicle, and warhead mass make it categorically different from the threat model that the Nimitz strike group's defensive architecture was designed and resourced to defeat? And what does its successful employment at this scale reveal about Iranian naval strike doctrine that every Western threat assessment had been placing 2 to 4 years further from operational reality than it actually was? Third, What is Washington actually confronting tonight? Not in the language of official statements, but in the operational reality of a situation where the most powerful Navy in human history has lost its most storied carrier and 6,200 sailors in 40 minutes. And why does the gap between what the situation demands and what Washington can produce define the most consequential moment of American strategic decline in the post-Cold War era? And fourth, what does the sinking of the USS Nimitz and the loss of 6,200 American sailors mean for that regional security architecture, for the alliance relationships that carrier presence has been underwriting for the global financial system whose stability has depended on American naval dominance of the world's most critical energy transit choke point, and for the multipolar order whose arrival this engagement has just accelerated beyond any diplomatic management? Every answer is coming. Stay with me. If you find this level of analysis valuable, the kind that goes beyond the managed narrative into the strategic reality that shapes events of this magnitude, subscribe and stay with me. Hit like. Share this with anyone trying to understand what the sinking of the USS Nimitz actually means for American power in the world. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them and they sharpen my own analysis. Now let us get into the full breakdown. From a professional standpoint, the targeting architecture of the Hormuz engagement is the most consequential anti-ship operation I have ever analyzed. And I want to be precise about what made it consequential, because precision matters here in a way that goes beyond analytical habit. What made the Hormuz engagement consequential was not the number of missiles fired, though 890 simultaneous inbounds represents a saturation density that no carrier strike group defensive architecture was designed to handle. What made it consequential was the specific combination of targeting intelligence, quality missile, terminal seeker capability, salvo coordination, precision, and warhead lethality against carrier-class targets that the engagement demonstrated Iran had achieved and that Western naval planning had consistently assessed as beyond Iranian operational reach. The engagement began not with a launch order, but with a targeting solution that had been building for 72 hours before the first Khorramshahr-4 left its launch rail. Iranian, over-the-horizon, radar systems, space-based tracking assets, and a signals intelligence collection network that had been characterizing the Nimitz strike group's electromagnetic signature for the duration of its Hormuz transit, had built a targeting picture of the strike group's position, course speed, and defensive posture, with a resolution that American naval planners had not assessed Iranian collection systems as capable of achieving against a maneuvering carrier strike group in open water. The Nimitz had been maneuvering. It had been changing speed and heading at intervals specifically designed to complicate adversary targeting solutions against a moving vessel at sea. Those measures are effective against adversaries whose targeting systems cannot update their solutions faster than the maneuvering vessel can change its parameters. They were not effective against an Iranian targeting architecture that was updating its solution continuously through multiple redundant collection pathways whose aggregate refresh rate exceeded the Nimitz's maneuvering cycle. The launch sequence began simultaneously from 47 separate launch positions distributed across the Iranian coastline from Bandar Abbas to the eastern Hormuz approaches, and from mobile platforms operating from prepared positions in the Zagros mountain range. The geographic distribution of launch positions served two simultaneous operational purposes against the strike group's defensive systems. Simultaneous inbounds from 47 separate geographic origins created an engagement geometry that prevented the Aegis destroyers from concentrating their intercept assets against any single approach sector, against American counter-battery targeting. The distribution across 47 positions meant that even a rapid and comprehensive strike against identified launch positions could not prevent the salvo from completing, because the vast majority of launches would have occurred before any counter-battery response could reach them. Wave 1, 220, Khorramshahr-4 defensive saturation. The first wave of 220 missiles was designed to saturate the strike group's intercept capacity before the primary anti-ship warheads arrived. These missiles were not carrying the heaviest anti-ship warhead configuration. They were carrying warhead packages optimized to survive intercept attempts and reach the strike group's inner defensive perimeter, forcing the Aegis destroyers and the Nimitz's own defensive systems to expend their standard missile inventory against a wave whose primary purpose was depletion rather than ship killing. The Aegis combat systems aboard the strike group's destroyer screen engaged at their maximum sustained fire rate. Standard Missile 3 interceptors launched in the layered response sequence that American naval doctrine prescribes for a mass ballistic missile attack scenario. The intercept rate achieved against the first wave was consistent with Aegis system performance against the ballistic threat class it was designed and tested against. The Khorramshahr-4 is not the threat class Aegis was designed and tested against. Wave 2, 280, Khorramshahr-4, destroyer screen elimination. The second wave of 280 missiles arrived as the standard missile inventory of the destroyer screen was reaching critical depletion levels from the first wave engagement. These missiles carried anti-ship warhead configurations specifically optimized against destroyer-class surface combatants, using terminal seeker packages that acquired the electromagnetic and thermal signatures of the Aegis destroyers, and guided to their engineering spaces and combat direction centers with an aim point precision that minimized the probability of near-miss outcomes. 3 of the strike group's 5 Aegis destroyers were struck by second-wave missiles before their standard missile inventories were fully depleted. 2 were struck after. All 5 sustained damage that degraded their combat direction center functionality before the third wave arrived. The strike group's outer defensive layer was gone. Wave 3, 240 Khorramshahr-4 combat air patrol suppression. The third wave of 240 missiles arrived carrying warhead configurations that included proximity-fused anti-air variants, specifically designed to engage the combat air patrol aircraft that represented the strike group's last meaningful intercept layer against the fourth wave. The employment of ballistic missiles against airborne combat aircraft is not a standard anti-ship tactic. It is a capability that Iranian operational planners had developed specifically to defeat the carrier strike group defensive architecture at the moment of its greatest vulnerability after the destroyer screen's standard missile. Inventory had been depleted, and before the carrier's own close-in weapon systems could engage the primary anti-ship wave, the Combat Air Patrol attempted to engage incoming missiles with their air-to-air weapons. Against a salvo density of 240 simultaneous inbounds with proximity-fused warheads, the result was catastrophic for the aircraft conducting the intercept attempts. Wave 4-150, Khorramshahr-4 USS Nimitz primary strike. The fourth wave of 150 missiles carried the primary anti-ship warhead configuration, whose specific design parameters I want to address in the weapons section, against a carrier strike group whose destroyer screen had been eliminated, whose standard missile inventories had been depleted, and whose combat air patrol had been catastrophically degraded. 150 Khorramshahr-4 missiles with anti-ship warheads in the 1,000-kilogram class and terminal seeker packages, specifically calibrated for carrier-class target acquisition, encountered defensive resistance that the post-engagement assessment characterized as negligible. The USS Nimitz absorbed the first impact at the engineering spaces below the waterline at 0312 local time. The second, third, and fourth impacts arrived within 90 seconds at the island superstructure, the flight deck amidships, and the aviation fuel storage spaces, whose ignition produced the catastrophic fires that sealed the ship's fate. The Nimitz, displacing 97,000 tons, sank in less than 3 hours. 6,200 sailors went with her. The Khorramshahr-4 is a weapon I have been watching with professional concern since Iranian state media first publicly acknowledged its existence. What concerns me is not its existence as a weapon system. It is the gap between what I assessed its operational employment capability to be and what the Hormuz engagement has demonstrated it actually is. Because in 30 years of military analysis, the gaps between my assessments and operational reality have generally run in one direction. I have occasionally overestimated adversary capabilities. I have never underestimated them at the scale that the Hormuz engagement reveals. I underestimated the Khorramshahr-4's anti-ship employment capability. The Khorramshahr-4 is a medium-range ballistic missile with a range of approximately 2,000 kilometers, placing every surface vessel operating in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Northern Indian Ocean within its engagement envelope from launch positions across western and southern Iran. Its propulsion system, a liquid fuel design whose pre-launch preparation requirements had been assessed as a survivability and vulnerability against preemptive American strike options, was employed tonight from mobile platforms with a launch preparation timeline that the 47 simultaneous launches demonstrated was considerably shorter than the Western assessment had placed it. The terminal seeker package is the Khorramshahr-4's most operationally consequential technical characteristic and the element of its design that the Western analytical community most consistently underestimated. The seeker combines an active radar that acquires large surface targets at ranges sufficient to allow terminal trajectory corrections before impact, an infrared imaging channel that discriminates between target signature categories and guides to the highest value thermal signature within a carrier strike group formation, and a data link that allows the missile to receive updated targeting information from Iranian surveillance assets during its mid-course phase if the target has maneuvered significantly from the pre-launch targeting solution. That terminal seeker architecture is what converted the Khorramshahr-4 from a ballistic missile that could be aimed at a ship's general location into a ballistic missile that could be aimed at a ship's engineering spaces. The distinction between those two outcomes is the distinction between damage and sinking, and the Hormuz engagement demonstrated that Iran had achieved the seeker capability required for the latter, with a reliability that the post-engagement assessment has confirmed exceeded 90% aim point accuracy against carrier class targets under operational conditions. The warhead mass carried by the fourth wave missiles against the Nimitz was in the range of 1,000 to 1,200 kilograms, depending on the specific variant employed against each aim point, against a carrier whose flight deck armor was designed for aviation operations rather than ballistic impact resistance, and whose underwater hull protection was designed against torpedo attack rather than against a warhead arriving at hypersonic terminal velocity from a steep ballistic approach angle. The physics of the impact were simply beyond what the VI ship's passive protection was built to handle. The first impact alone would have been sufficient to mission kill the Nimitz. 150 impacts in the sequence the fourth wave delivered were sufficient to sink her. The multiplication effect of 890 missiles organized into 4 waves, whose specific purposes were sequential defensive layer defeat followed by carrier kill, reflects a level of operational planning sophistication that goes beyond assembling a large inventory of capable weapons. It reflects the development of a complete anti-carrier warfare doctrine whose individual elements targeting intelligence, saturation, sequencing, seeker capability, and warhead lethality have been separately developed and integrated into a coherent operational package over years of sustained doctrinal work. That doctrinal work was the most significant intelligence failure associated with tonight's engagement. We tracked the weapons. We did not adequately track the doctrine. I know how Washington thinks in these moments because I have been in those rooms. I know the institutional culture that produces the initial response to a catastrophic operational failure. And I want to speak honestly about what that culture is producing tonight because I think the American public deserves directness from someone who has observed that culture from the inside. The initial institutional response to a catastrophic failure is not honest assessment of what went wrong. It is management of what the failure communicates. The first 24 hours after a catastrophic operational failure are consumed not by genuine strategic reassessment, but by the construction of a narrative that preserves as much institutional credibility as possible while acknowledging as little of the operational reality as the available evidence makes deniable. That is what is happening in Washington tonight, alongside the genuine grief, genuine shock, and genuine strategic reassessment that 6,200 missing sailors also produce. Both things are simultaneously true and both need to be acknowledged honestly. The specific strategic constraints that Washington is operating under tonight are more severe than any previous point in this conflict. The loss of the Nimitz has not merely reduced American naval presence in the region by one carrier strike group, it has demonstrated to every government on earth that American carrier strike groups operating within range of Iranian anti-ship ballistic missile systems are not deterrents, they are targets. And the demonstration was made at the cost of 6,200 American lives in a way that no subsequent carrier deployment can credibly offset without solving the terminal seeker and saturation problem that the Hormuz engagement revealed. The Khorramshahr-4 has effectively solved against current American naval defensive architecture. The escalation options available to the administration tonight all resolve to the same fundamental constraint. Retaliating against Iranian territory with American air power requires either accepting the loss of additional carrier-based aircraft operating within range of Iranian air defense systems whose operational effectiveness this conflict has repeatedly validated, or conducting strikes from standoff ranges that reduce the precision and persistence required to achieve the degradation of Iranian anti-ship capability that would make subsequent carrier operations in the region viable again. Neither option produces the outcome the administration needs on the timeline the domestic political situation demands. The domestic political consequence of 6,200 missing sailors is not manageable through strategic communication. It is not frameable as a tactical setback within a continuing strategic success narrative. 6,200 missing sailors is the largest single American military loss since the Second World War. It will produce congressional hearings, independent investigations, and a public demand for accountability that will consume the administration's political capital for months, regardless of what military response it produces in the immediate aftermath. The emergency session convening tonight is managing a military crisis and a political crisis simultaneously with resources adequate for neither. The sinking of the USS Nimitz in the Strait of Hormuz has altered the global strategic landscape in ways that compound across 4 dimensions, whose full consequences will take years to manifest, but whose direction is already unmistakable from tonight's events. The first dimension is naval deterrence collapse. The carrier strike group has been the primary instrument of American power projection since the Second World War. Its deterrent value has rested not merely on its combat capability, but on the psychological reality that challenging it carried consequences so severe that rational actors chose not to attempt the challenge. The Hormuz engagement has destroyed that psychological reality in the most public way possible. Every government on earth with a security relationship with Washington is tonight recalculating the deterrent value of American carrier presence against the demonstrated reality that Iranian anti-ship ballistic missiles can locate, track, and sink an American carrier in 40 minutes. That recalculation will produce security architecture adjustments whose cumulative effect on American alliance relationships will be felt for decades. The second dimension is Hormuz and energy market disruption. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil trade passes daily, is now a body of water where American carrier strike groups have been demonstrated to be targets rather than deterrents. The insurance markets that make global shipping economically viable have already begun suspending coverage for Hormuz transit operations. The tanker fleets that carry the energy lifeblood of the global economy are halting or diverting. The price discovery process that will transmit the Hormuz closure's economic consequences to every household on the planet has already begun in algorithmic trading systems that do not wait for official statements before pricing in. Supply disruption of this magnitude. Oil above $180 per barrel is not a temporary market reaction. It is the beginning of an energy price adjustment whose duration depends on a strategic resolution that Washington has no clear path to achieving. The third dimension is the petrodollar structural acceleration. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency has depended for 50 years on the connection between dollar-denominated energy transactions and American naval dominance of the sea lanes through which that energy flows. The sinking of the USS Nimitz in the Strait of Hormuz does not merely disrupt a single transit route, it challenges the foundational assumption that American naval power can guarantee the security of dollar-denominated energy trade at every point of vulnerability on the global supply chain. Gulf sovereign wealth funds are conducting emergency portfolio reviews tonight, whose conclusions will accelerate every trend toward dollar diversification that the preceding weeks of this conflict had already set in motion. The yuan-denominated energy settlement mechanisms that China has been building for over a decade will absorb sovereign investment at rates that the Nimitz's sinking has accelerated beyond any previous projection. The fourth dimension is the multipolar transition validation. Russia, China, and the broader coalition of states seeking alternatives to American-led order did not need to fire a single weapon tonight to advance their strategic positions. Iran's operational success has done it for them. Moscow watches American naval credibility suffer its most catastrophic single blow since Pearl Harbor, while Russian energy revenues flow at historically elevated prices sustained by the supply disruption the Hormuz engagement has produced. Beijing watches the dollar system enter structural stress of historic severity, while the alternative financial and security frameworks it has been building for a decade are adopted at accelerating rates by governments that have concluded the American-led system's military guarantor has just demonstrated limits it cannot overcome on any near-term timeline. My assessment is direct. The sinking of the USS Nimitz is not a setback within a continuing story of American naval primacy. It is the end of that story as it has been told for the past half-century and the beginning of a different one, whose outlines are already visible in the emergency sessions, the suspended insurance coverage, the halted tanker fleets, and the sovereign portfolio reviews happening simultaneously tonight in every capital that matters. In 30 years of military analysis, I have watched many engagements described as turning points that proved on reflection to be battles within a continuing strategic framework, costly battles, consequential battles, but battles that left the fundamental architecture of American naval primacy intact and operational. This is not one of those battles. The sinking of the USS Nimitz in 40 minutes by 890 Khorramshahr-4 missiles represents a qualitative change in the strategic environment that cannot be reversed by any diplomatic initiative, any emergency naval deployment, or any repositioning of assets whose vulnerability has just been demonstrated at the cost of 6,200 American lives. The American Navy will eventually deploy replacement carriers to the region. The financial system will eventually absorb the energy price shock that the Hormuz engagement has produced. The institutional communications machinery will eventually construct a narrative designed to make the loss of the Nimitz sound like a tactical setback within a strategic framework that remains fundamentally intact. But the strategic reality that 40 minutes in the Strait of Hormuz has demonstrated will persist regardless of what the narrative produces. Carrier strike groups within range of Iranian anti-ship ballistic missile systems are targets. That is not an assessment. It is an operational fact established at the cost of 97,000 tons of American naval hardware and 6,200 American sailors who went into the Strait of Hormuz on a mission whose threat assessment did not adequately reflect the capability that met them there. The question I leave you with is the one that I believe the American public, the families of 6,200 missing sailors, and every government that has structured its security around American naval guarantees deserves to have answered honestly. How did we build a naval defensive architecture that 890 missiles could defeat in 40 minutes? Who assessed the Khorramshahr-4 anti-ship capability and placed it 2 to 4 years further from operational reality than it actually was? And what does the institution responsible for those assessments owe to the 6,200 sailors who paid the price for getting them wrong? Leave your honest answer in the comments. Share this with every person who deserves the full picture rather than the managed version. Subscribe to US Watch Truth. Hit like if tonight gave you something the institutional coverage will not give you. The next update is already in preparation. Stay with me.